Hello and welcome to our looking at the upcoming scripture readings for the fourth Sunday of Advent, actually the fourth week of Advent. We're very close now to coming to the Christmas celebration. The readings for the fourth Sunday of Advent for the C year, and remember that this is the year in which in a special way we are looking at the tradition of Luke, but the gospel today is from Luke, would probably be one on any given fourth Sunday of Advent. But the three readings are the first from the prophet Micah, chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, from the letter to the Hebrews, chapter 10, verses 5 through 10, and from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 39 to 45. Now, as you will remember, and this, of course, is perhaps a little bit of a review, in the gospel traditions, there are two evangelists who tell us something about the conception, birth, and early life of Jesus, and that would be Matthew and Luke. And in fact, the gospels for the Christmas season are principally taken from those two writers. But the gospel this week comes from Luke. The two opening chapters of Luke's gospel are what we call infancy narratives, but as I mentioned, they're really much more about conception, as chapter 1 takes place, and then chapter 2 would be stories of the birth and early life of Jesus. The dynamic in which this section of Luke's gospel is composed, that is the two opening chapters, is in the form of what is called a diptych, which means, dip meaning two, a comparison between two, in this case, two persons. That would be between the person of John and the person of Jesus. Now, chapter 1 begins, and this would be a reading that we're not going to hear, but which was really one chosen for last time, that would be last year, begins with a story of a priest who comes to the temple in Jerusalem and is approached by an angel whose name, by the way, is Gabriel, who tells this priest, Zechariah, that he is to be a father. He kind of looks at the angel and says, well, now, that's nice. Not only will you be a father, but it will be a boy, and he will be an important person. Of course, Zachary says to the angel, you know, my wife and I, whose name is Elizabeth, are beyond the age of conceiving a child, that therefore we're older. Now, sometimes they're pictured as really very old, but I think the point is that they are beyond the period of time in those days in which conception of a child would take place. The angel says, but God is at work here, and you remember that Zachary is struck dumb until the child is born, as a sign that what he is hearing is really coming from God. The next verses, so that's the opening, takes place, as we see, in the temple in Jerusalem. Takes place, a place not quite known, but we will assume that it's Nazareth, to a virgin named Mary, and she is told that she is going to bear a child. She kind of says to the angel, that's nice, but you know, I've not had relationships with a man. The angel says to her, look, what God does, God is going to do, and that the child that is going to be born for you will also be a son. He will be called Great, Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David, and of his reign there shall be no end. So in this opening section of the diptych is a contrast between the conception of John and the conception of Jesus. Now that's the background for the reading that we're going to hear this week, because the young maiden, Mary, on learning that she is to be a mother, makes a journey into the hill country. Now there's a number of interesting kind of thing, and maybe just before I could get into that, this diptych is developed into 7 episodes. So episode 1, the Annunciation about the conception of John, point 2, episode 2 rather, the conception of Jesus, the meeting of the 2 mothers, which would be episode 3. Episode 4 would be the birth of the Baptist and his naming. Episode 5 would be the birth of Jesus and the events that take place there. Episode 6 would be the presentation of the child in the temple 40 days after his birth. And episode 7 would be the finding later on of Jesus in the temple when he's 12 years old. So this incorporates the first 2 chapters of Luke's gospel, and in some ways could almost stay in on their own, but in terms of the message that they are concerned with. All right, so with that, let's back up a moment now and look at this meeting between the 2 mothers. Now, Mary is pictured as making a journey to the hill country. Now, the supposition is if she lives in Nazareth, then the hill country would be somewhere in the south. Most likely that would be Judea. And what we're told is Luke, of course, is a wonderful storyteller, but he doesn't fill in details, and maybe we don't need to know those, although we're probably interested in that. Where exactly is the hill country that Mary is going to? Now, today, it's known as Ein Karim. It's a beautiful little suburb to the city of Jerusalem. It's only about 3-4 miles outside today of the city of Jerusalem. It's believed to be in tradition for a number of centuries, has held it to be the place of the birth of John the Baptist and also the place of the visitation. In fact, if you were to visit, when you visit there in the Holy Land in Ein Karim, one side there's a main road, but up one road is the birthplace church honoring the birth of the Baptist, and the other street up a little hill, very beautiful, is a church where the meeting between the 2 mothers, Mary and Elizabeth, took place. Now, the distance between where Mary comes and to the hill country is roughly about 100 miles. So that's a pretty good distance, and would have taken perhaps a good 4 days for someone to make that trip from Nazareth to the south. Raises some interesting questions. Would Mary have traveled alone? Because in those days, women did not travel alone. It was very dangerous, and plus, where would she be staying as she was making this journey? These are a lot of questions that some ask, and we don't have any answers, and Luke does not find them as important to have to deal with. Did she travel with a company? Sometimes that's the way in which people made these journeys. It was safer that way. There would be a littler danger from robbers and thieves and other kind of people who might be interested in those kind of things. So that's the background of Mary coming to meet Elizabeth. Now, the episode that happens when this section takes place really breaks down into 3 parts. First part is Mary's journey to the hill country. That would be in verses 39 to 40a. The greeting, number 2, and its effect on Elizabeth and the unborn child, and that would be verses 40b to 41, and then that would be Elizabeth's jubilant response to all of this would be verses 42 through 45. So those are the verses that we will be hearing and praying over this coming time. Now, as Mary enters we assume, the house of Elizabeth and Zachary, although Zachary does not appear, this is really a meeting between two mothers, one obviously older than the other, but both of them beginning the experience of being mother for the first time. But Elizabeth says to Mary as she approaches, "Hail, how is it to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" So Elizabeth takes the initiative, gives a greeting to Mary, and already admits, makes kind of an act of faith, that the child that Mary has, the mother of my Lord here would be capital, would be a reference, really, Yahweh, the name for God. So Elizabeth is making a marvelous profession of faith that the child conceived in Mary's womb is not just any child, but is the promised Messiah. For she says, "As soon as you came into my presence, the child within my womb," now she uses the phrase child, obviously conception for Elizabeth was, because the word, backing up a moment, when the angel Gabriel had appeared to Mary, it said that Elizabeth was already in her 6th month. So in that sense, certainly there was a good evidence of a child now already in the womb of Elizabeth. For Mary, if this journey took place very quickly after the Annunciation by Gabriel, would be in a much smaller state of development, would he not? But Elizabeth says, as soon as you came into our presence together, the child in my womb leapt for joy. So the child in the womb of Elizabeth recognizes that the child in the womb of Mary is someone important. Now it's important to notice, I mentioned this last time, that in John's story, there were many followers who accepted the John way, and that the Lucan tradition, respecting the followers of John, want to point out that that's fine. John was a precursor, and he was calling for someone to come after him, but the one who truly comes after him is Jesus, and therefore that's where things should be moving toward. So there's always this contrast that Luke makes between John and Jesus. John is important, Jesus is more important. And so you can kind of see where he is taking the material or taking the stories about John and Jesus. So Mary is greeted, and the child within her womb is greeted by Elizabeth and her child. So that's the drift, really, of the story that we will hear this weekend. It's just a little section from the first chapter. As I say, it's preceded by the 2 Annunciation accounts, and then we'll find that Mary leaves. Now, this part is not in the readings that we're going to hear, but Mary leaves, goes back to Nazareth, and then, as I mentioned, the 4th episode tells the birth of John the Baptist, because everything that has to do with preparing for the coming birth of Jesus happens in chapter 1 of Luke's Gospel. Chapter 2 will begin with a very traditional story that we hear every Christmas, and that is, of course, the story of the birth of Jesus. So the fact that the child within Mary and Elizabeth's bosom jumps for joy. Now, that's a characteristic of the Lucan Gospel. He often has people jumping around for joy. Maybe that's one of the characteristics he likes in his work. But one might remember that back in the days of David, and there is very strong connection in Luke's stories about the genealogy and lineage of Jesus being traced back to David, was that when the Ark of the Covenant, which of course was that famous box carried by the Israelites when they moved through the wilderness years under the aegis of Moses, when the Ark of the Covenant is brought into the Holy Land, David, when he wants to build a house for God, a temple, is told not to do it. Someone else will do it. His son Solomon will finally do that. But in the meantime, David brings the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. He has a special place for it. And David dances before the Ark as a kind of sign of joy, but also a sign of respect. So we suspect that Luke is aware of this Hebrew and biblical tradition and sees all of this because later tradition will hold that Mary is really the new Ark of the Covenant, because in this case, the covenant Ark, if you want, is Jesus in her womb. And so this symbolic dancing, if you want, before Mary by the child within Elizabeth's womb may all be part of that kind of way of thinking. There's a lot of biblical background to this. Not that you're going to hear a lot about it when we preach on the weekend, but it's perhaps nice to see kind of the artistry of the writer Luke and how he blends these things together. Now, with that in mind, one might look at the first reading, which comes from the prophet Micah. Now, Micah was his book appears later on as one of the prophets. He probably was a prophet during the time, again, of Hezekiah, but he says, and this is the connection that you'll read very carefully, that when the Savior is born, he will be born in Bethlehem Ephratah. Now, you say, well, does that matter? Yes, it does, because actually in the biblical world, there were two Bethlehems. There was a Bethlehem that was located up in the Galilee, although we don't hear too much about it, and then Bethlehem of Ephratah, which is in the Judean territory, which is in the south, and was reputed to have been the home birthplace of David. Bethlehem is not David's city. David's city is Jerusalem. But that this was the place where he was born seems to be the rich part of the tradition. And of course, David grew up to be a shepherd, and there's reference to the fact that there will be a shepherding takes place. So all of this is recorded by Micah. Micah, by the way, is not one of those very pleasant prophets. This is one of the most hopeful section of his work. And as I said, he was concerned about the people of his own time, and in fact said some pretty strong words toward them. But nevertheless, this is the message of hope that he brings to a people who have suffered. And as I mentioned, Micah says there will be a new David. And of course, we can see this as wonderfully applying to Jesus and why this first reading is used today. In this sense, however, it should be seen that the child born in Bethlehem Ephratah is not a successive of David, of the Davidic kingship. That was another issue. And so there really are two kind of ways of looking at the lineage of David, but Bethlehem becomes the birthplace, and therefore is why Luke, as we know in chapter 2, begins of his gospel, brings Jesus to Bethlehem to be born. So all of that is a little bit of the background for this coming week as we look at the story of this wonderful kind of relationship. And there's all kinds of speculation when you think about it, that the two mothers are both going to bring children into the world. does Mary kind of seek the wisdom of an older woman as to what things to do, although she too is really in a new position? And does the new mother learn give something of importance to Elizabeth? I, with the little time that we have, want to mention, of course, as we enter into the latter days of the Advent season, that beginning on the 17th of December, which would be the end of this coming week, and moving to the 23rd of December, are a series of special antiphons which are known as the O antiphons. Now they're connected with an important prayer, and you probably have done some reading about this, known as the prayer of the hours. Now the prayer of the hours, by those who are kind of priests and deacons would recognize that as the prayers of what was called the breviary, but it's really the prayer of the hours, developed by the monks back already in the early part of the Middle Ages. Not in the by the Middle Ages they were well in effect, but earlier part, and are usually attributed to the founder of Western monasticism, Benedict. Benedict was interested, as you remember, in his monks, in those who dedicated themselves to God in the monastery, that there be a good balance in what they did. And the theme of the Benedictines was ora et labora, work and prayer. And so he develops a way in which prayer is spread throughout the day for the men who made up those who were called nuns. Women also followed the same pattern. There were 8 different times of prayer. 2 of them became more important than the others in a certain way. One was a prayer said always in community, always with others. Important to see that the original design here was not so much personal prayer, but communal prayer. One was at sunrise, and this was known as lauds. And one was at sundown, and this was known as vespers. And these were the 2 major times when the community of believers was invited to come together and to pray. In fact, in recent times, there has been an emphasis to restore to parish communities the praying of the hours, at least those 2 sections. It's not so easy to do in the world that we are a part of, because in the monastic tradition, much of course what they survived on was farming, or growing grapes. Well, that's still farming, but the idea was that the monks were self-sufficient, could take care of themselves, but their day was laced with prayer. And so if as I say, lauds, sunrise, vespers, sunset, varied from year to year. Obviously, in the winter, sunrise was late, so you got to sleep in a little longer, or did you? And but sundown began much quicker. So you can see that these 2 hours were the flexible ones. And then there were permanent ones. They were called prime, terce, sex, and none. So the community would gather for prayer at prime, 6 o'clock in the morning, terce, 9 o'clock in the morning, sex, 12 noon, none, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So you see, wherever the monks were, they were expected to kind of quickly drop what they were doing, get to the community room, pray together. These prayers didn't take real long, but nevertheless, it kept prayer integrated into everyday life. So those would be the major times. And then when you went to bed, that is, the monks went to bed, prayer time called Compline, and this is still used in many of the, by the way, many of the monasteries still use these today. And to make life interesting, there was a special hour of prayer anywhere from 1 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the morning. This was called matins. So if they went to bed, say, or 8, 9 o'clock, they had to get up, this hour of prayer, and then they could go back to sleep if they could. So matins, it was the longest. It had readings and all those kind of things. Now, we're not advocating that, but here's where I'm going with that. These special antiphons were known as the O antiphons, and they had to do with the coming of Jesus, certain titles that would be appropriate to him, and they were drawn from the Old Testament. And these antiphons are used at the Vesper prayer. That would be the evening prayer of the monastery, but also today, the evening prayer of the church. Now, you probably have seen these, but may I just quickly review what they are? They're very beautiful in their own way. The first is called and always, why are they called O? Because they start with O, okay? Even in Latin or in English, it's still O. O wisdom is the first. O Adonai and ruler, a reference to the fact of Moses receiving the commandments from the Lord. O root of Jesse, obviously Jesse, the father of David, and from which the whole tradition emerges. O key of David. David then, of course, the great king. And the prayer here is, O key of David and scepter of the house of Israel, you open and no one closes. You close and no one opens. Come. So this is going to be one of the prayers of each one of these antiphons. Come. In this case, come, deliver from the chains of and prison those who sit in darkness, and bring them and in the shadow of death. So the next is, O day spring, or O rising dawn. The next one is, O King of the Gentiles and desire of all the nations. And this is a kind of important one. You are the cornerstone that binds two peoples, Jews and Gentiles, into one. Come and save humankind whom you have fashioned under clay. So if you think about even that, fashioned out of clay, well, that reminds one of Genesis, doesn't it? How God created. See, so that a lot of Old Testament imagery is brought into these O antiphons. And the final one is O Emmanuel, our King and Lawgiver. Now, if you want to find where these antiphons are incorporated into a very popular Advent hymn, O come, Emmanuel. And if you look at the fact that there are all these verses, each one of the verse really takes one of the old antiphon ideas and incorporates it into that particular hymn. Interesting, O come, Emmanuel, in the hymn that we sing is really the last one of the old antiphons. But I mention all of that because it is certainly a very beautiful custom, and even if we were not able to perhaps gather together to pray the old antiphons, you can probably find them online or in a number of books, and giving a certain kind of historical background of where Jesus fits into many of the expectations of those who were looking forward to the Messiah. So they are called the O antiphons. You will find them, as I say, perhaps interesting and a little different Advent prayer. It's, as I say, the last, not the last day. Now, it ends on the 23rd because the 24th, the day before, or Vigil of Christmas, has its own particular prayer form. Well, thank you for being with us. And once again, as this coming weekend, the fourth Sunday of Advent, it's also known as Grandparents' Day because the roots of the lineage of Jesus are connected with David and his family. With all of that in mind, have a good week, and we hope to see you again next time.